Welcome to You and Your Democracy. It's a short take civics lesson as part of our program, Where Do We Go From Here? I'm Chuck Parkinson. Each episode, we will look at the head and heart of democracy. We will explore the values and the principles that have created our American exceptionalism and examine the structures and institutions that give us the guardrails of our democratic republic. To quote Benjamin Franklin when asked in 1787 after the Constitutional Convention, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or monarchy?" To which Franklin responded with a rejoinder at once witty and ominous: "A republic if you can keep it." So now let's take a look at what is this great American experiment, and then ask, what do we need to do to keep it? In today's episode, we are discussing why government and what is the value of government. I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Pamela Carriveau, Assistant Provost and Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Black Hills State University. Welcome, Pam. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's jump right in. Why government?
Well, it's interesting. I find that I often have to explain why government. Government definitely has a bit of a bad rap, doesn't it? I think I want to remind everyone that when we think of government, that it needs to include, of course, national government, but also state and local government. So when you're thinking about the value of government, think about that local government that provides important services like garbage pickup and public schools. So uh, basically, I would argue that, we have government so that we're able to do the things that we couldn't or we wouldn't be able to do as private individuals or businesses.
I think that's a good touch on, and the old idea. Having been involved in the political world for the balance of my career, one of the big things that the joke that always existed was, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you," and that still runs around in a lot of circles that happens to a degree. But government is there for a reason. And could you touch a little bit on the scope and some examples of what people may or may not think of every day?
Sure, I think if you want a good starting laundry list of what government does for us, there's no better place to look than the preamble to the Constitution. Basically, we can run down the list, and some of you could probably sing the Schoolhouse Rock song along with me as I go through it. Form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. Those are the things that are listed in the preamble to our Constitution, and it's really a list of what government does for us.
Yeah, along that line. And people don't always think about that. We often hear people refer to the Constitution, but but it's a very short rejoinder that they use from that standpoint. But to dig over that, peel that onion back, and take that one layer away from those sorts of things, the role of government. I was glad you touched on not only national, because there always is a focus on national, but the thing that affects people most is the local government, the things that local government can provide for people.
You're absolutely right. And so let's pick one of those things that I listed from the preamble, promoting the general welfare. And there are a lot of really good examples from national level, like NASA, national parks, but of course local, like public schools, and a lot of times they overlap. I've actually been doing a little bit of research into the Rural Electrification Act, which probably doesn't sound terribly exciting, but actually has a lot of relevance to people in South Dakota and Wyoming. In 1936, when they created this act, 90% of farms lacked electric power. And frankly, if you I think about my grandparents' ranch, there is no way that a rancher would have been able to afford to develop the infrastructure on their own to get those power lines out to the ranch, right? So you're basically working in the dark for a long time, a lot of hours of the day. And so the Rural Electrification Act, or the REA, right, allowed for the expansion of electricity into rural areas. And the thing is, it's not an old thing. It's not out of touch. It's not dead and gone. In 2009, the USDA invested over $34 billion in rural electrification projects. So it's still working. And they're still doing it now. They're using this act to expand broadband telecommunications and rural internet into areas. And so something like that, that's not something that a local rancher or a local farmer would be able to afford to do on their own. But together, we can pool our resources and promote the general welfare and allow for people across the country to have access to things that they wouldn't be able to do individually.
I think this touches very closely when you mentioned your grandparents' farm. In the mid 1950s, when I was 5 or 6 years old, one of the best things that happened was that we went to my mother's parents' ranch down on the edge of the Badlands. And that winter, they had electricity for the first time. And it was an incredible experience not to have to go in and look at being a town kid to that degree, coming in and look and actually having electricity in the house as opposed to lamps. And the heat at night were rocks in the bottom, heated
Right.
rocks in the bottom of the bed. And the other thing I think people need to realize with all these great things that are happening from that standpoint, that each one of these things and why we need to have that interest is in the government, and because it's a two-way street. That money that's being spent to provide assistance to us is our money.
That's right.
And I think that's one of the things people often forget is the fact that all those services, we're paying for those services. We're not always all totally in agreement with them all the time, but it is one of those things that is very, very important to remember from that standpoint. Hence the responsibility of the government to the individuals.
You're absolutely correct. And the alternative is probably not something that we want. I'm thinking of examples of failures in this area. Um, did you know that in 2010 and in 2011, there were two homes that burned in rural Tennessee because the local fire department wouldn't put the fire out? Why wouldn't they put the fire out? Because the homeowners hadn't paid their $75 subscription fee. If we run a lot of these services as private businesses or private organizations, then people who can't afford to or simply forget to pay their bill or for whatever reason, they end up losing things, right? It's not a collective good, it becomes a private good, and only those available to those who can afford it. Or alternatively, it's available to the people that we agree to allow to pay into it. So another one of those things from the list of the preamble is establishing justice. And we don't want firefighting services or police services, or frankly, even the driver's license office to only be open to people that fit the profile that we agree with, or alternatively, people that we don't agree with. We don't want to be excluded from those services. So government, one of the things, and I know bureaucracy is kind of a bad name, but one of the good things is that it establishes democratically agreed upon rules as for how do we provide these services in a way that we hope is non-biased.
That's a very good point. I think that, and thanks for raising that issue because it is a case where there's always been the long rhetoric for years and years in the political world. It's government needs to run more like a business, but there are functions that businesses would not follow through on from that perspective. As we look at, you use an example of the firehouses and who wouldn't fight the fire in Tennessee, and we look at other things that government brings to us. Not, as you said, not always in the best of manner. Sometimes government doesn't work as well as it does. Are there any examples that you might give where maybe we learned from something that wasn't done well the first stroke in government, and then we've improved on that and evolved to provide things better?
I think that's a really interesting question. I was thinking about this in the context of South Dakota. And one of the things, of course, we live in South Dakota, but a lot of the products that we use come from places thousands of miles from here. And an example of how we learned and we've used government to improve lives would be, I assume maybe you all read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in high school or in college, and we look at the meat packing business and the kinds of contaminants that were allowed to go into food that then would be shipped across the country. There's really no way for me living in Spearfish, South Dakota, to have any kind of idea of how clean a factory is or what processes people are using when they're creating, the food that I eat. So I rely on government to establish the FDA to make sure that food, drugs are safe in this country. It allows for the development of public health and sanitation. That's just really important. It also allows me to have, I guess, figure out who's going to make sure those common goods, those public goods like air and water, are kept clean, so that I don't have to go track down which factory or which company is polluting the water, 100 miles up the creek.
That's a good point. I'm working together to reach that is a very important thing to think about. And you mentioned and for years, South Dakota farmers and ranchers have worked very hard to make labeling an important portion
Right.
of the food and to make sure that it was safe, because our livelihood, for the most part, our largest industry here depends upon being certified to be disease free and everything else. So that's what helps us sell our goods everywhere else.
That's
But it
right.
also, as you said, protects us from stuff that is coming into into the country to that degree. These have been very good points we've raised today. But as we run down to the last minute or so, do you have any thoughts you'd like to leave with us that we haven't touched on?
I think we also see that the government isn't always effective and it isn't always efficient. Um, but it generally allows us to do big things more effectively, more efficiently. When it's working well, it allows us to accomplish those things together. And then hopefully we learn from those examples of where it didn't work so well and we make improvements in the future.
Well, that's a good note for us to end on today. I think that raises some questions which maybe we can address in future episodes and when we get back together to talk about other issues and more specifically into specific issues that we have. That's our episode for now. I want to thank Dr. Pam Carriveau for sharing her expertise and thoughts with us today. And as always, our executive producer, Suzanne Stratford, and the SDPB technical staff for their creativity and hard work on this program. Thank you also to the supporters of South Dakota Public Broadcasting who make this program possible. To view previous episodes in this series, go to sdpb.org/election. If you have comments or suggestions for future episodes, send us a note at programming@sdpb.org. Until our next short take, I'm Chuck Parkinson.